Close your eyes. The year is around 600 AD. The Roman Empire has fallen away from Britain like a tide that never returned. The great stone roads they laid still cut through valleys, though grass creeps over them. Their villas stand in ruins, roofless, walls broken, fig trees long dead. The baths are cold, the markets silent. What remains is a land of scattered peoples. Saxons, Britons, Picts, Scots, Angles, all carving out fragile worlds in a Britain half forgotten. The forests have grown thicker, the villages smaller, the nights darker. The sound of wolves howling across a moor is not legend, it is reality. This is the Dark Age, and tonight you and I will wander through it together, slowly, gently, carefully. We will see how people lived, how they ate, how they worshipped, how they loved, how they survived. Before we walk further, I invite you to gently subscribe to this channel, press like, and share a comment with where you're listening from tonight. It helps us continue these journeys, and it lets us know which corners of the world we are whispering this story into. Now, let us step into the first day of a Dark Age life.
Part 1. Dawn in a Dark Age village. The first thing you notice is the cold. There is no glass in the windows, no bricks to seal the wind, only wooden walls stuffed with clay and straw. Through gaps in the thatch, the night air has crept in, damp and biting. The family sleeps on the floor, on straw mattresses covered with woolen cloth. The hearth at the center of the hut has gone from flame to smoke. Under a gray pile of ash, the embers still glow faintly, waiting to be coaxed back to life. A woman stirs. Her hair is tangled, her hands roughened by work. She pulls on a woolen tunic, its fibers coarse against the skin. A man wakes too, stretching, pulling a leather belt around his waist. A child coughs in the shadows, then curls tighter beneath a blanket. Outside, the world is wrapped in mist. A cock crows. Chickens shuffle in the dirt, pecking for food. A pig grunts from its pen. Beyond the huts, the fields stretch out, long strips of earth, ready to be worked with wooden plows dragged by oxen. This is no quiet countryside idyll. Survival depends on the land. Each harvest must be enough to last the winter. Each day without rain matters. Too much rain matters even more. Breakfast is simple. A flat bread of barley baked on the hearth's edge, perhaps a spoon of pottage, grains boiled with herbs and whatever scraps of meat or beans can be spared. There is no sugar, no tea, no coffee. Only water from the well, sometimes beer made weak enough that even children drink it, safer than raw water. The soundscape is raw and living. The creak of wooden doors, the lowing of cattle, the rush of wind across the thatch. No wheels rumble, no church bells yet toll in every place. Only the rhythm of animals, people, and land. Step outside and look around. There are no great castles yet, only timber halls for a local lord, ringed with ditches and palisades. The huts of common folk cluster near them, bound together for safety. The air smells of smoke and damp earth, and above, the sky is pale and wide, stretching endlessly over Britain's hills, rivers, and forests. This is morning in Dark Age Britain. Simple, raw, uncertain, but alive. Arrival in Dark Age Britain. Close your eyes and imagine Britain, not as we know it today, with towns and roads and humming traffic, but as it was more than 1,500 years ago. The Romans had gone. Their legions, their baths, their villas and mosaics, abandoned, broken, left to weather under the damp sky. Their roads were still there, stretching straight across hills and valleys, but grass sprouted between the stones, and wolves padded along them at dusk. Close your eyes and imagine Britain, not as we know it today with towns and roads and humming traffic, but as it was more than 1,500 years ago. The Romans had gone, their legions, their baths, their villas and mosaics, abandoned, broken, left to weather under the damp sky. Their roads were still there, stretching straight across hills and valleys, but grass sprouted between the stones, and wolves padded along them at dusk. The people who remained looked around at the ruins and saw mystery. Huge stone walls and crumbling amphitheaters stood silent, taller than anything they could build. For many, these were the work of giants or forgotten gods, not of men like themselves. The air was colder, the winters harder, the seas rougher than in Rome. This was not the Mediterranean. This was Britain, a damp, windswept island of forests, rivers, and fog. Now, the Dark Ages had begun. There were no more emperors in London. No single power ruled the island. Instead, warlords, petty kings, and tribal chieftains carved the land into pieces, each clutching at power. Villages huddled together in clearings, smoke rising from wooden huts, animals penned close by for warmth. Life was short, often brutal, and always uncertain. But in that uncertainty lay the rhythm of survival. Imagine waking at dawn in a roundhouse roofed with thatch, the smell of peat smoke heavy in your clothes. Rain taps softly on the roof. The fire, banked overnight, is coaxed back to life. A child stirs on a bed of straw. Outside, the world is quiet except for the lowing of cattle, the croak of crows, the slow drip of water from trees. This was life in Dark Age Britain. Not a single story, but thousands of small, fragile lives, all bound to the earth, to the seasons, and to the constant edge of hunger.
Everyday life in the villages and fields. Picture a village in the middle of the Dark Ages. There are no tall stone houses, no glass windows, no tiled roofs. Instead, it is a cluster of round houses or timber huts, their thatched roofs dripping in the morning dew. Smoke curls through the air, sometimes finding its way out of holes in the roof, sometimes lingering low and stinging the eyes. Inside, the walls are dark with soot, the air thick with the mingled smells of damp wood, earth, and animals. Most people slept on straw, sometimes covered with rough wool blankets if they were lucky, sometimes only with hides or cloaks. A family lived close together, parents, children, and often a grandmother or uncle sharing the same space. Chickens scratched about in the corner, and sometimes a piglet or goat might be kept inside during the cold months, its breath steaming in the dim firelight. At dawn, the household stirred. There was no alarm, only the crow of roosters and the natural rhythm of daylight. The first sound in many houses was the scraping of flint against iron, striking sparks to rekindle the hearth. Without fire, there was no warmth, no food, no light. Once the flames caught, someone would stir the embers, add peat or wood, and begin to cook the simplest of meals. What did they eat? Porridge, thick and coarse, made from oats or barley boiled in water, sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt, if it could be spared. On rare occasions, honey sweetened it. Cheese was another staple, soft, hard, or crumbly, depending on what animals they kept. A little milk, watered down, perhaps bread, heavy and dark, baked on stone or in an earthen oven. Meat was rare for ordinary folk, a treasure kept for feasts or stolen bites after slaughtering a pig in winter. Most of the year, the diet was plain, repetitive, but enough to keep people working.
After eating, the village came alive. Men and boys trudged to the fields, carrying wooden plows drawn by oxen. The land was not easy. Britain's soil was thick, wet, and heavy. Plowing was exhausting, the furrows slow to cut. The crops were barley, rye, wheat, or oats, depending on the land. Fields had to be cleared of stones, hedges kept up to protect them, ditches dug to drain water. There were no machines. Every step, every clod turned over was sweat and muscle. Women worked no less hard. They spun wool into thread, wove cloth on looms, tended the vegetable gardens, carried water from streams or wells in heavy buckets, and watched over the children. Laundry was done by hand, beaten on stones, or scrubbed in cold water until the skin of the washer's hands went raw. For cooking, herbs were gathered from hedgerows, roots pulled from the ground. The children played, but play was also practice. Boys whittled sticks into spears, threw stones at posts, or imitated their father's plowing. Girls practiced grinding grain or carrying small bundles of wood. Childhood was short. By the age of 7 or 8, children were expected to take on real work. The village itself was small, perhaps only a few dozen souls. A simple hall stood in the center, sometimes used for meetings, sometimes for feasting. At its edges were barns and storehouses. Fences creaked in the wind, dogs barked at shadows, and the paths between houses turned to mud in the rain. There was always the smell of earth. The air carried the scent of dung from animals, of smoke from hearths, of damp leaves in the woods. Life was closer to nature than ours today, and nature could be cruel. A sudden storm might flood the fields. A late frost could kill crops. A sickness might spread through the cattle, leaving families hungry. And yet people endured. They laughed, they sang, they told stories by firelight. In the evening, when the work was done, the sound of voices rose in the dark. Old songs passed down from elders. Tales of heroes, sometimes prayers whispered to pagan gods or to the Christian saints who were slowly becoming known. This was the rhythm of everyday life in Dark Age Britain. Work, eat, endure, and repeat, season after season. Harsh and simple, yes, but not without moments of joy. A good harvest, a child's laughter, a feast in the hall when the larder was full. People and class, peasants, warriors, and kings. In Dark Age Britain, not all lives were equal. Just as the land was divided into fields and forests, society itself was divided into layers. At the bottom were the peasants, the countless men and women whose hands worked the soil, whose backs bent under the weight of harvests, whose bellies were often half empty, but who kept villages alive. Above them were warriors and nobles, men who fought, raided, and defended their people. At the very top sat kings or tribal leaders, small rulers in scattered territories, each holding sway over a patch of Britain. Imagine first the life of the peasant. For them, survival was the only goal. Their wealth was measured not in silver or gold, but in grain stored in clay jars, or in the number of animals in their pen. Their clothing was rough-spun wool, often itchy, dyed in simple browns or grays. Shoes, when they had them, were crude leather tied with strips of hide. Their hands were calloused, their faces weathered from the wind. They lived in houses that offered little privacy, where family, fire, and animals all shared the same smoky air. Peasants had little freedom. In some places, they were bound to their lord, owing service and labor in return for protection. In others, they lived in small king groups, tied by blood, with each person contributing to survival. Their lives were fragile. One failed harvest, one raid, one harsh winter could destroy everything.
Above them stood the warriors. These were men trained to fight with spear, sword, and shield. They were the muscle of the age, the ones who rode out to raid a rival's village or to defend their own against attack. A warrior's life was dangerous, but it carried honor. They drank mead in the Lord's hall, wore better cloaks, sometimes trimmed with fur, and carried weapons that peasants could never dream of owning. Iron was precious, and a sword was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of power, passed down through generations. Warriors swore loyalty to a lord or king. In return, the lord gave them food, clothing, and sometimes land. Loyalty was everything. To betray one's lord was the deepest shame. To die in battle was not a tragedy, but often seen as the proudest end a warrior could meet. Songs were sung of those who stood bravely with their shield walls unbroken, their banners held high against the storm. And then there were the kings. These were not kings of great empires like Rome had known, but small rulers, chieftains of tribes, or lords of territories no larger than a modern county. Still, to their followers they were mighty. A king's hall was larger than the peasant's hut, sometimes richly decorated with carved wood and painted shields. Inside, feasts were held, gifts were given, oaths were sworn. A king was judged by his generosity as much as by his strength. He was expected to reward his warriors with treasure, arm rings of silver, cloaks of bright color, weapons of iron. A king who was stingy soon lost followers. A king who was generous gathered men around him, eager to fight at his side. But even kings lived under constant threat. Rival rulers might send raiders across the border. Alliances shifted like the wind. Power was never secure. A throne could be lost in a single battle, and with it, the lives of all who defended it. And above even kings, at least in belief, were the gods and the saints. Some still clung to the old gods, spirits of the woods and rivers, thunder gods, war gods, protectors of hearth and harvest. Others were beginning to kneel before the Christian cross, to listen to the prayers of monks and bishops who spread across the land. This mix of faiths colored every class, every hall, every hut. So life in Dark Age Britain was not just survival, but also status. Whether you were a peasant sowing oats, a warrior holding a spear, or a king giving gifts in your hall, your place was known and your duties were clear. In that world, to step outside your role was dangerous. To forget loyalty, honor, and kinship was to risk losing everything. Faith and rituals, pagan beliefs, and the rise of Christianity. In the hush of Dark Age Britain, faith was never far from daily life. The people of that time lived close to nature, and they saw mystery in every tree, every storm, every flicker of firelight. To them, the world was not empty, but alive with spirits and powers that shaped their fates. Long before Christianity spread widely, the people turned to the old gods. In the rolling hills and deep forests, shrines were raised to beings unseen. A grove of ancient oaks might be holy ground. A spring bubbling from the earth might be a sacred gift. People whispered prayers to the spirits of rivers, hoping for fish. They lit fires at midsummer and midwinter, marking the endless turning of the year. The gods of war and thunder were honored by warriors, for battle was constant and protection was needed. Farmers prayed to gods of fertility and harvest, begging for enough grain to last the winter. Women carrying children wore charms or whispered invocations for safe births. Death, too, was sacred. The burial of kin was done with care. Grave goods placed with the body, a sword, a brooch, a bead of glass, tokens to carry into the next world.
Rituals bound the people together. Feasts were held at solstices. Bonfires roared on hilltops, the sparks flying into the night like 1,000 tiny stars. Some rituals were joyous, filled with song and dance. Others were somber, the hush of voices rising under the moon. The line between the living and the unseen was thin. Ghosts, omens, and strange signs were taken seriously, for in a world without certainty, every hint of the supernatural carried weight. But alongside these old ways, a new faith was spreading. Christianity, once carried here by Roman missionaries, was stirring again in the north and west. Monks traveled with little more than books, wooden crosses, and their voices raised in prayer. They built small churches from timber and stone, simple chapels where bells rang out across the fields. To many, Christianity was strange at first. The cross, the stories of saints, the chanting of Latin words, all seemed foreign. But slowly the faith took root. Kings who converted gained alliances with Christian neighbors. Monks brought literacy, teaching the art of writing, of setting thoughts in ink upon parchment. They taught not only prayers, but also ways of measuring time, of copying knowledge, of keeping records. But the shift was not sudden. For centuries, Britain was a place of both pagan and Christian belief. In one village, families lit fires at Beltane, dancing in the fields. In another, a small church stood, its priest chanting prayers for the souls of the dead. Sometimes both existed side by side, the old ways blending with the new. This mixture colored the rituals of daily life. A warrior might wear a hammer amulet for Thor, yet still listen to a Christian priest's blessing. A woman might leave an offering of milk at a sacred spring, yet also trace the sign of the cross before bed. The people wove the two faiths together as they sought safety, health, and meaning in a world that was harsh and unpredictable. In those dark centuries, faith was not abstract. It was lived, breathed, and felt in every moment. In the flicker of firelight on the walls of a hut, in the tolling of a monastery bell, in the silence of the woods where spirits were thought to dwell. To believe was not a choice, but a necessity, for without faith there was only fear.
Struggles, hunger, sickness, and raiders. Life in Dark Age Britain was never secure. Each season carried its own dangers, and every family lived with the knowledge that hardship might be only a day away. Hunger, sickness, and the threat of raiders hung over villages like storm clouds, always near, always feared. Hunger was perhaps the most constant shadow. The year's survival depended on the harvest. If the summer was too wet, grain sprouted poorly. If the winter was too long, food stores ran out before spring returned. Imagine a family huddled around their hearth in February, the jars of grain nearly empty, the salted meat long gone, the children thin and weary. Meals became smaller. Bowls of thin porridge stretched to feed many mouths. Sometimes bark, roots, or weeds were ground into flour, giving bread a bitter taste. A poor harvest one year might be endured, but 2 years in a row could mean starvation for the weakest. Alongside hunger came sickness. Illness was a part of daily life. Colds, fevers, and coughs spread quickly in smoky, close-packed houses. A cut from a sickle might fester into infection. A child might weaken from measles or whooping cough. Cattle carried diseases that sometimes passed to their keepers. There were no doctors in the modern sense, only healers with herbs, charms, and experience passed from elders. Willow bark was chewed for pain, honey smeared on wounds, nettles boiled for strength. Some remedies worked, others were little more than hope wrapped in ritual. And then there were darker illnesses, fevers that swept through villages, leaving silence in their wake. A mother might lose 3 children in a single season. A chief might watch his warriors fall not in battle, but in bed, their strength stolen by unseen sickness. To people of the time, these were not just diseases. They were punishments from gods, or curses, or spirits taking revenge. Fear gave them names, and stories were told to explain why they came.
As if hunger and sickness were not enough, raiders lurked beyond the horizon. From across the sea, ships sometimes appeared, their sails swelling with the wind. Men poured ashore with swords and axes, burning, stealing, taking what they could. Villages close to the coast lived with constant fear. At the first sight of sails, smoke rose from signal fires, warning neighbors of danger. Even inland, threats came. Rivaled tribes or ambitious warlords raided for cattle, grain, or slaves. At night, the silence of the woods might be broken by the clash of weapons, the cries of attackers. A village could be wiped out in an hour. Its huts burned, its people scattered or killed. Survivors carried scars, both on their bodies and in their memories. And yet, people endured. They knew the risks, but they also knew the rhythms of resilience. They stored grain in pits or jars to guard against lean years. They told stories around the fire to explain sickness and give comfort. They built alliances, pledged loyalty to lords, and kept watch on the horizon for sails. Struggle was not the exception, it was the rule. To live in Dark Age Britain was to walk each day on the edge between survival and loss. And still, through hunger, through illness, through raids, families grew, villages rebuilt, and life continued because there was no other choice but to endure.
Seasons in nature, how the land shaped life. In Dark Age Britain, nature was not a backdrop, it was the stage on which every life was set. The land, the weather, and the turning of the seasons ruled all things. Without the steady rhythm of nature, there was no food, no safety, no life. Spring was a time of hope and labor. After the long hunger of winter, the thaw brought green shoots pushing through the earth. The fields had to be plowed, the seeds scattered, the animals tended carefully. Calves, lambs, and kids were born in this season, their first cries mingling with birdsong in the cool air. For families, spring was a promise, the chance to begin again, to fill the barns before another winter came. Yet, it was also a race against time. Work was constant, for any delay meant weaker harvests when autumn arrived. Summer was the season of growth. Days stretched long, the sun warming the land. Crops rose tall in the fields, barley, oats, rye swaying in the breeze. Villagers cut hay for animals, mended fences, repaired roofs. Children splashed in streams, watched by weary mothers. But summer was not only warmth, it also brought storms that flattened crops, droughts that withered them, or heat that spoiled stored food. People watched the sky with worry, reading signs in the clouds. Then came autumn, the most crucial time of all. The harvest meant survival. Men and women worked from dawn to dusk, sickles flashing, gathering every stalk of grain. Fires glowed at night as the village celebrated, drinking mead, sharing food, giving thanks to gods or saints. The barns filled with sacks of grain in the air rich with the scent of apples, nuts, and smoked meat. Yet beneath the joy was fear. Was it enough? Were the stores full enough to last through the cold months?
Winter was the true test. The days grew short, the nights long and bitter. Frost silvered the fields, rivers froze, snow blanketed the earth. Families huddled indoors, fires burning low to save fuel. Smoke blackened the rafters as people stayed close, telling stories, repairing tools, mending clothes. Outside, wolves prowled the forests and hunger gnawed at the edges of every meal. For the poor, winter was cruel. Thin blankets, meager food, and sickness turned it into a season of dread. Yet there was also beauty. The hush of snow on a silent morning, the glitter of ice on bare branches, the sense of waiting for light's return. The land itself shaped where people lived. Britain was a patchwork of forests, marshes, and rolling hills. Rivers were lifelines, providing fish, water for crops, and paths for travel. Forests offered wood for homes and fuel, but also danger in the form of wild animals or hidden raiders. The sea was both barrier and bridge. It protected from some threats, but brought others, carrying ships of traders or warriors to the shore. The seasons were not just weather, they were woven into the calendar of rituals. Spring was marked with festivals of fire, celebrating rebirth. Summer held gatherings and feasts, marriages, and meetings between tribes. Autumn brought thanksgiving, offerings for safe harvests. Winter carried stories of spirits, of the dead, of gods who ruled the long night. To live in Dark Age Britain was to live with the land, not against it. People rose and slept with the sun, ate what the earth and animals gave, feared what storms or frosts might bring. Nature was not gentle, but it was everything. It provided, it punished, it decided. And so each year turned in its eternal cycle, binding every life to the rhythm of the earth.
You awaken to the tolling of a bell, deep, heavy, echoing through mist that clings to the earth. It is not the bright golden chime of a church tower in some later century, but a dull clang from a rough cast iron bell hung in a wooden frame outside a monastery. It calls not to a bustling town, but to a handful of robed monks and a scattering of villagers who still sleep huddled in low huts of wattle and daub. The year is somewhere in the 7th century, in the shadowy stretch of Britain that later poets and chroniclers will call the Dark Ages. The name itself is misleading. Life here is not absent of light nor of meaning, but it is dimmer, narrower, more fragile than the centuries that will follow. You open your eyes inside one of those huts. The roof leaks smoke, not warmth, as the single hearth smolders with damp peat. A mother wraps her child in a rough woolen blanket spun by her own hands. Outside, the ground is slick with mud, churned by pigs rooting for scraps. You hear the caw of crows perched on a withered oak, the creak of leather as a man tightens his belt before venturing to the fields. This is life in Dark Age Britain, hard, uncertain, yet threaded with ritual and resilience. Food is scarce in winter. The diet of ordinary folk is humble, thin gruel made from barley or oats, sometimes thickened with beans or peas. Meat is rare, saved for festivals or the wealthy. Most families live close to the edge of hunger, storing their grains in pits dug into the earth, sealed with clay. In lean times, acorns or roots are ground into coarse flour, bitter but filling. And every mouthful carries risk: spoiled bread, tainted water, the unseen presence of parasites that sap strength silently. But there is more to life than hardship. Across the damp hills, monasteries begin to rise as islands of learning. Within their stone walls, monks copy manuscripts by flickering candlelight, their pens scratching Latin words onto vellum made from stretched calfskin. To the villagers, these monks are mysterious figures, part holy, part otherworldly, guardians of stories and prayers that most cannot understand. And yet, their bells mark the rhythm of the day. Work begins, pauses, and ends at their call, giving shape to lives otherwise ruled by the sun and the seasons. Outside these cloisters, warlords and petty kings vie for control. Britain is fractured. Tribal kingdoms of Saxons, Angles, Britons, Scots, and Picts, all struggling for land, cattle, and honor. A simple farmstead might one year pay tribute to one lord and the next to his rival who sweeps through with swords and fire. Raids are common. Loyalty is survival. And yet, in the dim glow of a hearth at night, families still sing old songs, tell old stories of giants, saints, and heroes, weaving threads of identity through generations. Dark Age Britain is not a place of progress, but of persistence. Imagine the smell of damp wool, never quite dry, the taste of bitter ale brewed from barley, the feel of rough wood beneath your fingers as you mend a plowshare. Imagine the silence of the fields, broken by the distant horn of a war band or the faint chant of monks carried on the wind. It was not a golden age, nor a time of great comfort, but it was a world where survival itself was a victory, and where every dawn carried both danger and hope. If you're still with me, take a breath. Let your mind wander as though you were stepping barefoot into that muddy village. And before we journey deeper into this forgotten time, make sure you've tapped that subscribe button to join us here on Urgent Talks. Leave a comment telling us, would you have survived a winter in Dark Age Britain, or would the hunger and cold have claimed you? Share your thoughts, and let's see who among us might have endured.
The day begins to stretch across the misty hills. The village stirs slowly. Smoke curls from a dozen hearths, carrying the smell of peat, damp wool, and the faint tang of cooking oats. Children run barefoot, their feet hardened by mud and cold, while elders tend to livestock, sheep, goats, and a few scraggly cows that provide milk, but little else. Every sound is amplified in the quiet. The clatter of a wooden bucket, the grunt of a man lifting hay, the cry of a newborn in the straw bedding. Life is dictated by the seasons. Spring brings hope and toil in equal measure. Fields are plowed with primitive wooden plows pulled by oxen, seeds sown carefully, prayers whispered to the gods and saints for sun and rain in equal measure. Summer is a frantic rush to harvest what little the soil provides. Autumn a mix of gathering and fear, as stores must last through the bitter winter ahead. And winter, a long, dark, and hungry time, is survival itself. Snow blankets the hills, ice coats the river, and food becomes a sacred commodity.
Every loaf of bread, every handful of barley is rationed with precision. The social order is harsh but simple. Lords and their small war bands control the land. Peasants toil, pay tributes, and live under threat of raids or punitive taxes. The concept of law is local and fluid. A dispute over cattle might be settled by a lord's court or by a fight at dawn. In such a world, respect is earned through strength, cunning, or piety. Those who fail are left to endure or die. Faith, however, is a constant companion. Christianity has spread across much of Britain, yet pagan beliefs persist in the hills and forests, whispered in superstitions, charms, and folk rituals. Monks copy sacred texts in the flickering candlelight, their chants filling stone abbeys with haunting echoes. Villagers pray before planting, before eating, before sleep, fearing the wrath of unseen forces if they fail to honor them. Religion is both a comfort and a tool of control, a lens through which suffering and injustice are interpreted, sometimes with fatal consequences. Disease and death shadow every life. Fevers rise from contaminated water, wounds fester without proper care, and children die at terrifying rates. Midwives and wise women provide herbal remedies, yet even their skill cannot prevent plague or malnutrition from claiming the young and weak. Mortality is a constant teacher, and the cycle of life is harshly visible. Births celebrated quietly, deaths mourned briefly, and the village turning relentlessly onward. Yet within this darkness there is resilience, humor, and ingenuity. People carved wooden toys for children, fashioned clothing from patched wool, and bartered goods to survive. Stories are told by firelight, legends of heroes, saints, and tricksters, binding the community with shared memory. Music rings from flutes and simple drums, laughter bubbles through the fear of monotony, and for fleeting moments joy pierces the bleakness. Every inhabitant navigates a delicate balance, laboring, praying, and surviving. Even a small act, baking a loaf without burning it, sewing a tear in a child's tunic, or catching a fish for dinner, is a victory against the indifferent world. And though society is fragmented, the land and its people are bound together by a rhythm older than any king, older than any monastery. The endless turning of seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the constant march of life against the shadow of mortality. As night falls, darkness returns, heavy and silent. Smoke from the hearths mingles with mist, lanterns flicker in doorways, and the village sleeps fitfully, aware that tomorrow will demand the same struggle, the same resilience, the same careful negotiation with fate. And in that night, as you imagine yourself there, you begin to understand the Dark Ages were not merely dark in the sense of ignorance, but dark in the weight of survival, in the tenuous grip on life, and in the fragile threads of society holding together against constant threat.
Childhood and growing up in the Dark Ages. In the villages and hamlets, childhood was brief and harsh. Children were not pampered. They were apprentices of survival from the moment they could walk. Boys learned to herd animals, swing crude wooden tools, and understand the rhythms of planting and harvesting. Girls were taught the household arts, spinning wool, grinding grain, fetching water, and tending younger siblings. Every task was practice for the life that awaited, and mistakes could mean injury or worse. Play existed, but it was a luxury. Stones and sticks became toys. Simple games mimicked the adult world of hunting, fighting, or trading. Dolls carved from wood or rags provided lessons in care and responsibility. Songs and stories were passed orally, a rich tradition of memory, history, and superstition that shaped young minds. Every story, every warning had a lesson: survive, obey, and respect the unseen powers that govern daily life. Education was rare and limited. Only children of the wealthy or of monastic families learned to read or write. For most, knowledge was practical: how to sew, hunt, repair, and bargain. Literacy was not just a skill, it was a shield, a doorway to influence, and a privilege few could ever touch. Even in monasteries, children learned scripture, Latin prayers, and copying skills, often in dim candlelight that strained eyes and backs alike. Farming, food, and survival. Life revolved around the land. Fields were small, often rocky or poorly drained, and crops were vulnerable to weather, pests, and disease. Barley, oats, rye, and beans were staples, supplemented by root vegetables like turnips and cabbages. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions or those wealthy enough to afford livestock. Hunting and foraging provided supplemental protein, yet such tasks carried risk. Wolves prowled the forests, and accidents in rivers or marshes were common.
Food scarcity was constant. A bad harvest could bring famine, illness, and even social unrest.
Communities stored what they could: dried herbs, salted meat, and grains, carefully rationed. Every meal was a negotiation with survival. Festivals and feast days were moments of abundance and joy, but they were rare. When they came, they were celebrated with bread, ale, roasted meats, and songs, fleeting glimpses of pleasure and a harsh world. Superstition, religion, and the unseen. Faith governed every thought, word, and action. Pagan remnants lingered in charms, amulets, and whispered prayers to the land and sky. Christianity spread, yet was interpreted through local customs and fears. Monks and priests were both guides and enforcers, offering salvation but also warning of eternal punishment. Villagers lived in constant negotiation with the unseen. Illnesses were curses, misfortunes signs, and dreams omens. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women held knowledge of the old ways, sometimes tolerated, sometimes feared, and occasionally persecuted. Every choice, when to plant, when to harvest, whom to marry, was influenced by fear and superstition. Violence, raids, and warfare. Dark Age Britain was a land of constant threat. Raids by rival clans or Viking invaders were a grim reality. The sudden appearance of long ships on the horizon could bring fire, death, and destruction. Villagers fortified themselves in hill forts or simple wooden palisades, yet even these offered limited protection. Weapons were basic: axes, spears, wooden shields, and bows. Fighting was brutal, close, and personal.
Men trained for defense from an early age, while women learned survival in other ways, hiding children, storing food, and maintaining the household under threat. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and cunning spread orally, becoming legends that shaped local identities. Even in peace, the memory of raids haunted daily life, shaping how communities built, farmed, and traveled. Health, disease, and mortality. Life expectancy was shockingly low by modern standards. Disease, malnutrition, and childbirth claimed countless lives. Smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis, and later the plague swept through villages with terrifying speed. Medical knowledge was limited. Treatments were crude: herbs, poultices, and prayer, and often did little more than delay death. Infant mortality was devastating. Many children never survived to adulthood. Every birth carried anxiety. Every cough or fever sparked fear. Midwives were revered, yet vulnerable, blamed for failures they could not control. The harsh reality of mortality shaped communities, rituals, and the way people approached life itself, cautiously, pragmatically, and with a deep awareness of death's proximity. The daily rhythm. The day was defined by the sun. At dawn, the village awoke. Fires were stoked, animals fed, children sent to tend flocks or fetch water, and the fields claimed the labor of adults. Work never ceased. Mills ground grain, women spun and wove, men repaired tools and fences. By dusk, exhaustion pressed on every body. Meals were eaten quickly, often cold, before nightfall brought darkness and the unknown. Nights were dangerous. Wolves prowled, thieves stalked, and the unlit paths were treacherous. Lanterns and torches provided little comfort, and the darkness carried fear and mystery alike. Yet in this peril, communities bonded. Neighbors warned each other, shared fire and food, and celebrated small victories. Stories, songs, and laughter, rare but vital, pierced the gloom, providing warmth against an indifferent world.
Trade, markets, and the flow of goods. Even in the shadow of scarcity, trade was a lifeline. Markets and fairs were the heartbeat of medieval towns. Here, farmers, artisans, and merchants gathered to exchange goods, coins, and news. The clatter of wooden carts over cobblestones mingled with the cries of vendors hawking their wares: baskets of apples, salted herring, loaves of bread, bundles of wool, and handmade tools. Trade was more than economics, it was social interaction. Townspeople exchanged gossip, arranged marriages, and reinforced alliances in the bustling marketplaces. Traveling merchants brought exotic goods, spices from the east, fine cloth from Flanders, or metalwork from Scandinavia, offering glimpses of a world far beyond a local village. But these traders also brought risk. Thieves, counterfeit coins, and disease accompanied commerce as readily as silver did. Markets operated on a strict rhythm. Prices fluctuated with harvests, weather, and war. Haggling was expected, and a keen eye could save a family enough to survive the lean months. Children ran errands for their parents, carrying baskets or coins, learning the skills of negotiation early. Every transaction was a lesson in survival, patience, and cunning. Towns, settlements, and travel. Settlements in Dark Age Britain were small, tight-knit, and fortified whenever possible. Hill forts, timber palisades, and ditches provided protection against raiders, while natural features like rivers and hills offered additional defense. Within these walls, houses clustered together, built from timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs that glowed golden in the evening sun. Smoke spiraled from hearths, mingling with the scent of livestock and cooking fires. Travel was arduous. Roads were few and often little more than muddy tracks. Travelers faced hazards at every turn: bandits, treacherous weather, and hostile locals. Long-distance journeys were typically undertaken only by merchants, messengers, or those forced by circumstance. Inns were rare, and travelers often relied on the hospitality of monasteries, small villages, or even the generosity of strangers. Yet movement brought opportunity. Pilgrimages to sacred sites, attendance at distant markets, or service in a lord's household expanded horizons. Stories from afar filtered back into villages, shaping perceptions, superstitions, and aspirations. To live even briefly outside one's home community was to glimpse the vast, uncertain world beyond. Festivals, marriages, and family life. Life in the Dark Ages was punctuated by communal celebrations. Festivals marked the rhythms of the year: harvests, solstices, religious holidays, and local saints' days. Villagers dressed in their best, or what passed for best, sang songs, danced around fires, and shared communal meals. These gatherings were brief respites from labor, offering joy, connection, and a sense of belonging. Marriage was practical as much as emotional. Dowries, land, and alliances often dictated unions. Love could exist, but it was secondary to survival and social stability. Women married young, often in their teens, while men married later, once they could provide for a family. Children arrived quickly, contributing to both the household workforce and the perpetuation of the family line. Family life was labor-intensive. Homes were multifunctional spaces: kitchens, sleeping quarters, workshops, and sometimes stables all in one. Privacy was minimal. Meals were simple. Children learned to help from a young age, and the elderly often relied on family support until death. Bonds were strong, forged through shared toil, scarcity, and dependence.
Women's roles in societal expectations. Women in Dark Age Britain carried immense responsibility. From managing households to tending fields, spinning cloth, brewing ale, and raising children, their labor was indispensable. Yet society valued them primarily for their ability to sustain the family and bear children. Social mobility for women was rare. Opportunities outside domestic and agrarian work were limited to trade, craft, or, in some cases, religious life. Widows and unmarried women faced particular hardships. Without a husband or male relative to provide support, they were vulnerable to poverty, exploitation, or displacement. Some found security in convents, others in crafts or service, and a few took extraordinary measures to survive, sometimes challenging societal norms in the process. Clothing, crafts, and material culture. Clothing reflected status, occupation, and regional style. Wool was the most common material. Linen was prized for undergarments. Rich dyes, red from madder, blue from woad, were expensive and signaled wealth. Accessories like belts, brooches, and jewelry indicated social rank or professional affiliation. Footwear varied from simple leather shoes to more elaborate boots for the wealthy. Crafts flourished despite hardship. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Weavers produced cloth for local use and trade. Potters shaped clay into vessels for cooking and storage. Every object carried utility and value, often passed down through generations or traded at markets. Even the simplest homes were adorned with handmade implements, reflecting skill, necessity, and pride.
Political intrigue, kings and chieftains. The political landscape was fragmented. Small kingdoms, tribes, and lordships competed for land, resources, and influence. Kings and chieftains wielded power unevenly, relying on loyal warriors, alliances, and, at times, intimidation. Governance was a mix of custom, law, and force. Disputes were settled through assemblies, duels, or warfare, with ordinary people caught in the crossfire. Royal courts were centers of intrigue, diplomacy, and spectacle. Banquets, hunts, and ceremonial gatherings showcased power, wealth, and influence. Alliances were forged and broken with marriages, gifts, and oaths. The king's favor could mean prosperity or exile. The wrong word in the wrong place could cost life or liberty. Religion and superstition in daily life. Faith permeated every corner of life in Dark Age Britain. Christianity had spread across the land, yet old pagan beliefs lingered, creating a rich tapestry of devotion, fear, and ritual. Villagers prayed daily, not just in church, but at home, invoking saints and angels for protection from disease, famine, and misfortune. Monks and priests acted as spiritual guides, healers, and record keepers. The local church was more than a place of worship. It was a community hub, a court, and a refuge. Bells called the faithful to prayers, and the rhythm of liturgical days structured work, rest, and celebration. Superstition coexisted with faith. Farmers interpreted the behavior of animals, the patterns of clouds, or the appearance of comets as signs of future events. Amulets, charms, and household rituals were common, often blending Christian and older beliefs. A woman might sprinkle salt at thresholds to ward off evil spirits, or leave offerings at sacred springs to appease unseen forces. Holy days and saints' festivals punctuated the year. Pilgrimages were undertaken for healing, penance, or favor from the divine. Traveling to shrines like Lindisfarne or Glastonbury was both a spiritual and social journey, connecting distant communities and exposing pilgrims to new ideas, goods, and challenges. Crime, punishment, and justice. In Dark Age Britain, justice was harsh, uneven, and often brutal. Theft, assault, or trespass could result in fines, corporal punishment, or execution, depending on the crime, the social status of the offender, and the whims of local lords. Communities often handled disputes collectively. Courts of elders or assemblies settled minor conflicts, emphasizing restitution over incarceration. Blood feuds could erupt when wrongs went unresolved, and families took vengeance into their own hands, perpetuating cycles of violence. Public punishments were both deterrent and spectacle. Floggings, stocks, and mutilations reminded the population of the consequences of transgression. The guilty might have a hand cut off for theft, or be hanged in the village square. Even minor offenses could bring humiliation. A farmer who failed to fulfill obligations might be paraded through town with a sign of shame. Law was intertwined with loyalty. Powerful lords often acted as judge, jury, and executioner in their domains, enforcing rules that suited their interests. Ordinary people navigated a landscape where justice was rarely blind, and survival often required cunning as much as honesty. Medicine, disease, and death.
Life was precarious, disease was a constant threat, and medicine was a mix of herbal remedies, superstitions, and rudimentary practices. Plague, smallpox, dysentery, and malnutrition ravaged populations. Healers, often women, prepared poultices, teas, and salves, while monasteries preserved knowledge in herbal texts. Doctors, when available, relied on humoral theory, balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bloodletting, leeches, and charms were common treatments. Surgery was crude, pain management limited to alcohol or herbal sedatives, and outcomes were unpredictable. Death was an ever-present reality. Infant mortality was high, life expectancy low, and communities were marked by graves, memorials, and the constant need to prepare for the afterlife. Funerals were both somber and communal, a reminder of mortality and the fragility of human existence. Warfare, raiders, and defense. Violence shaped the landscape. Raiders from across the seas, Vikings from Scandinavia, for instance, attacked coastal towns, burning settlements and taking captives. Local lords raised militias to defend their lands, while fortified settlements offered some protection. Weapons were simple but effective: spears, axes, swords, and bows. Armor was basic: leather, chainmail, or shields, and strategy often outweighed brute strength. Battles could be swift and devastating, leaving villages in ruins and survivors struggling to rebuild. The constant threat of attack influenced daily life. Communities worked together to maintain walls, watchtowers, and signaling systems. Trust and cooperation were essential, and fear of the next raid shaped behavior, trade, and travel. Stories, songs, and oral tradition. Despite hardship, culture thrived in oral traditions. Bards, skalds, and storytellers carried news, history, and myth from village to village. Tales of heroes, saints, and legendary battles were shared around hearths, keeping collective memory alive. Music accompanied daily work and ritual. Simple instruments, harps, flutes, drums, provided rhythm for dancing, labor, and storytelling. Songs preserved moral lessons, commemorated victories, and entertained, creating shared identity and continuity. Even in the darkest days, these stories offered hope, reflection, and connection. They reminded people of bravery, cleverness, and resilience, proving that life, though fragile, was worth remembering and celebrating. Daily life, work, hunger, and survival. Dawn broke over a misty village, gray light spilling across uneven thatched roofs and muddy paths. Life in Dark Age Britain began before the sun fully rose. Farmers rose first, hands raw from winter cold, working fields with wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowing grain or tending livestock. Women carried water from wells, churned butter, baked bread in clay ovens, and cared for children, their labor unending and unrelenting.
Food was scarce and monotonous. Bread, porridge, cabbage, and the occasional fish or salted meat formed the staples of the diet. Hunger was constant, and famine was a recurring shadow. A failed harvest could mean weeks of malnutrition. Families rationed meals carefully, often giving the least to children or the elderly first, prioritizing the strongest to survive harsh winters.
Homes here's in hardship. Most people lived in small, single-room homes made of timber, wattle, and daub. The smoke from hearth fires lingered in the rooms, leaving walls blackened. Straw mats served as bedding. Animals, dogs, chickens, pigs, shared the space. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Families ate, slept, and worked in the same cramped quarters. Sanitation was primitive. Waste was discarded in the streets or nearby pits, and rivers often doubled as water sources and sewer systems. Illness spread quickly. Households were vulnerable to infections, and even minor injuries could become fatal. Life expectancy hovered in the 30s, though some hardy individuals defied the odds. Daily chores were relentless. Women ground grain with querns, spun wool into thread, brewed ale, and sewed clothing. Men repaired tools, repaired fences, and tended to fields. Children assisted as soon as they could, carrying water, gathering firewood, or watching younger siblings. Life was labor, punctuated by brief moments of rest or celebration. Secrets, superstitions, and shadows. Even in routine, shadows lingered. Superstition guided behavior. People feared witches, spirits, and curses. A sudden death in a village could be blamed on malefic magic rather than disease. Herbs and charms were worn for protection, and advice from local wise women or priests was sought in times of crisis. But some secrets were darker. Bandits roamed the countryside, taking what they could. Lords might exploit peasants with heavy taxes or forced labor. And behind closed doors, personal betrayals, jealousy, forbidden love, or hidden violence shaped lives in ways that public records rarely reveal. Trust was scarce, and survival often meant keeping secrets, lying, or bargaining with unseen forces. Travel, trade, and connection. Despite danger, trade connected villages, towns, and distant lands. Markets thrived on barter, wool for salt, grain for iron, honey for cloth. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers brought new stories and sometimes disease. Travel could be deadly, but it was also necessary. A failed crop, a shortage of tools, or a missed shipment could spell disaster for an isolated community. Bridges, ferries, and rudimentary roads shaped trade routes. Rivers were lifelines, and towns often grew around crossing points. Inns and alehouses offered shelter and social hubs, though often crowded, dirty, and tense. Travelers needed caution. A misstep could mean theft, assault, or worse. Yet human curiosity and need drove them forward. Children, education, and apprenticeship. Childhood was brief. From an early age, boys learned trades, farming, smithing, carpentry, while girls were trained in household skills, cooking, weaving, tending animals. Literacy was rare, only the children of nobles or clergy could read and write. Monasteries often provided education, teaching Latin, religious texts, and basic arithmetic. Apprenticeships began as early as 7 or 8. Children learned through observation, imitation, and labor, absorbing practical skills essential for survival. Mistakes were costly. Injuries, harsh punishment, or social disgrace were part of the learning process. Childhood was a preparation for the relentless demands of adult life. Community, festivity, and relief. Even in hardship, life held moments of reprieve. Festivals, harvest celebrations, and holy days offered escape. Dancing, singing, and feasting broke the monotony of work. Music filled villages, and storytelling preserved history, culture, and local identity. Communities bonded over shared toil and shared fear. Neighbors helped each other in times of sickness or famine, offering food, shelter, or labor. Social cohesion was survival. Isolation often meant death. Solidarity was the key to enduring life in a harsh world. This section paints an immersive, realistic picture of daily life in Dark Age Britain, blending struggle, superstition, and fleeting moments of joy. Raids, violence, and the constant threat. Imagine waking to the sound of hooves thundering on muddy roads, the clanging of metal, and distant screams carried on the wind. In Dark Age Britain, danger was never far. Villages could be peaceful one day and destroyed the next. Raiders, Vikings from across the sea, rival clans, or opportunistic bandits attacked without warning. Their goals were simple: plunder, slaves, and survival. Houses of timber and thatch burned quickly. Smoke blackened the sky, and the smell of fire and death hung heavy over the landscape. Families fled into forests or rivers, carrying what little they could save. The men fought with spears, axes, and shields, but the outcome was often grim. Women and children hid, prayed, or were taken as captives. Survival depended on speed, luck, and cunning. Even outside raids, violence shaped everyday life. Feuds between families or villages could last decades, erupting in bloody skirmishes. Justice was often personal. Revenge killings and duels maintained honor. Men carried weapons at all times, and trust was scarce. A stranger's smile might hide a dagger, and a friendly handshake could conceal deadly intent. Fortifications and defense. To survive, communities relied on fortifications. Earthworks, wooden palisades, and simple ditches surrounded villages.
Hill forts offered elevated refuge, and some towns built crude stone walls. Villagers trained in basic combat. Archery, spear handling, and shield defense were essential skills, not pastimes. But defenses were never perfect. Raiders often attacked at night, exploiting gaps in watch rotations. Fire arrows and siege tactics overwhelmed poorly prepared villages. Even the best defenses could fall, leaving survivors to flee or negotiate with invaders, often at terrible cost. Life in a violent world. Violence was normalized. Children learned early to fear the sound of hooves or the scream of alarm. Women carried knives, men practiced combat drills, and villages maintained lookouts. Fear was a constant companion, shaping decisions, movements, and social interactions.
Yet people adapted. Villages developed warning systems, drums, bells, or signal fires to alert neighbors of approaching danger. Communities stored food and valuables in hidden caches. Alliances formed between settlements, offering protection through collective strength. Every day was a balance between labor, survival, and vigilance. Psychological toll. The constant threat of violence left a psychological mark. People lived with anxiety, grief, and loss. Funerals were frequent and mourning was part of life. Yet resilience persisted. Storytelling, rituals, and faith provided a mental refuge. Legends of heroes, protective spirits, and saints gave hope in an unpredictable world. This chapter captures the tension, fear, and resilience that defined life under constant threat. The audience can almost hear the hooves, smell the smoke, and feel the panic of fleeing villagers. Health and medicine. Imagine a world without hospitals, antibiotics, or even consistent access to clean water. In Dark Age Britain, illness was a constant shadow. Minor injuries could become fatal, and a simple infection often meant death. Cuts from farming tools, scrapes from timber work, or bites from animals carried a high risk. A wound left untreated could fester, and poisons or herbs were often the only remedies available. People relied on herbal knowledge, passed down orally through generations. Willow bark, for example, contained natural compounds to reduce pain and fever, and early aspirin. Garlic was used to fight infections, and honey for wounds. Yet, treatments were inconsistent, and superstition mingled with practice. A healer might chant incantations over a sick child, apply poultices made from strange roots, and sprinkle salt to ward off evil spirits. Sometimes the treatment helped, often it did not.
Midwives were crucial figures. They guided women through childbirth, a time of immense danger. Many mothers and infants did not survive, as complications were common and medical knowledge limited. Midwives used herbs to ease pain or induce labor, and often doubled as spiritual guides, offering prayers or charms. Their skill could mean the difference between life and death in an era where medical care was scarce. Disease and epidemics. Diseases ran rampant. Smallpox, dysentery, and typhoid were part of daily life. Communities had little understanding of contagion. Illnesses spread quickly through close quarters, contaminated water, and poor sanitation. Plagues could decimate entire villages, leaving survivors traumatized and fearful. During outbreaks, isolation was minimal. Sick individuals were often cared for by family who risked their own lives. Rituals and prayers were common, as people sought divine intervention. The line between medicine and religion blurred. Herbs, charms, and blessings coexisted in every household. Nutrition and daily survival. Food scarcity worsened health. Diets were simple: coarse bread, grains, beans, and occasionally meat or fish. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to disease. Seasonal shortages brought famine, forcing desperate measures. Children and the elderly suffered most. Villagers preserved food through salting, smoking, or drying, but spoilage was frequent. Rotten grains or contaminated water could trigger illness. Even in times of plenty, hunger was never far from mind. Every meal was a calculation, every coin and loaf critical for survival.
Mental fortitude and community support. Despite the constant threats of illness, injury, and famine, communities adapted. Sharing resources, collective labor, and mutual aid created a fragile but crucial safety net. People turned to storytelling, songs, and rituals to maintain hope. Belief in spirits, saints, and protective charms offered psychological comfort, helping them endure harsh realities. The resilience of Dark Age Britons was remarkable. They faced disease, injury, and death daily, yet built villages, cultivated crops, and maintained social bonds. Life was precarious, but survival depended on resourcefulness, knowledge, and community. The rhythm of daily work. The day in a Dark Age village began before the sun had fully risen. Farmers, laborers, and children stirred to the crowing of roosters.
The air was crisp, sometimes thick with mist rolling off rivers and marshlands. Tasks were dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the crops. Fields had to be plowed, sown, and harvested with hand tools, wooden plows, sickles, and spades. Every action required strength, endurance, and precision. Men often labored from dawn until dusk. They cleared forests, tended animals, repaired fences, and maintained irrigation ditches. Children helped too, carrying water, feeding animals, or weeding fields. Work was grueling, but necessary. Failure meant famine. Women's labor was equally crucial. They ground grain into flour, baked bread, churned butter, spun wool into thread, and sewed clothing. They managed the household's survival, cooking, cleaning, and tending sick family members. A woman's skill could determine whether a family endured the winter or starved. Food and diet. Diet was simple and heavily reliant on what could be grown or hunted. The staples were barley, oats, rye, and wheat. Bread was a primary food, ranging from coarse, dark loaves for peasants to lighter, whiter bread for the wealthier classes. Pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat, was a daily meal. Meat was scarce for commoners. Pigs, goats, chickens, and occasionally cattle were raised, but most of their products went toward barter, trade, or special occasions. Fish was vital in coastal or riverside communities. Salted, smoked, or dried, it supplemented diets and provided necessary protein.
Seasonal foods determined survival. Berries, nuts, wild herbs, and mushrooms were gathered from forests, adding nutrition and variety. Foraging was a skill everyone learned, and it could mean the difference between life and death in lean months. Farming techniques and tools. Farming was backbreaking. The plow, pulled by oxen, was heavy, and the soil often stony. Tools were rudimentary, made from wood and iron, and repairs were constant. Crop rotation was practiced, but knowledge was limited. Fields could become exhausted after years of use. Animals provided labor, food, and fertilizer. Horses and oxen were crucial for plowing and transport. Sheep offered wool for clothing and trade. Every animal was a resource, a measure of wealth, and a cornerstone of survival. Markets and barter. Surplus crops were taken to markets, where barter and trade sustained villages. Coins were scarce. People exchanged goods and services. A farmer might trade grain for tools, cloth, or a chicken. Markets were vibrant centers of gossip, barter, and information, connecting isolated villages to the broader world. Seasonal fairs were events of spectacle. Merchants, entertainers, and craftsmen converged with villagers to sell goods, perform, and share news. These gatherings were also opportunities for young people to meet potential spouses, but there were equally spaces where danger and theft lurked. The cycle of survival. Life was a constant cycle of work, preparation, and vigilance. The seasons dictated rhythm: spring for planting, summer for tending crops, autumn for harvesting, winter for repair, preservation, and rest. Each day required careful attention to tools, livestock, and family. Mistakes were costly. Yet, despite harshness, there were moments of human connection: shared meals, songs during harvest, communal labor, and storytelling by the hearth. These moments brought relief, laughter, and a sense of continuity amidst uncertainty.
Village layouts and communities. Dark Age villages were small, often clustered along rivers, streams, or fertile land. The houses were close together, forming tight-knit communities where everyone knew each other. Villages were surrounded by fields, pastures, and sometimes protective ditches or palisades, especially in areas prone to raids. Paths between homes were muddy and wet weather, dust-choked in dry months, and often shared with livestock. Smoke from hearth fires curled into the sky, carrying the scent of cooking, burning peat, and the faint tang of animals. Villagers lived in constant awareness of their neighbors, for help in emergencies, for gossip, and for survival. Homes and construction. Most homes were simple. Walls were made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden sticks plastered with mud and straw. Roofs were thatched, using reeds or straw, sometimes replaced every few years. Floors were bare earth, packed down to be firm with rushes strewn for warmth and cleanliness. The interiors were dimly lit by small hearths or clay ovens. Smoke escaped through gaps in the roof, filling the rooms with a pungent odor that mingled with the scent of cooking and livestock. Furniture was minimal: stools, benches, wooden tables, and a few chests or shelves. Beds were simple, often straw-stuffed mattresses on raised wooden frames. Privacy was limited. Families slept together in one room, and spaces were multifunctional. Meals, crafts, work, and sleep all shared the same area. Despite cramped conditions, homes were hubs of life, with children playing, women working, and men repairing tools or planning the next day's labor.
Social life and customs. Communal life was crucial. Villagers celebrated seasonal festivals, shared in work like harvests, and supported one another in times of sickness or attack. Storytelling by the fire was a common pastime, where elders recounted legends, local history, and practical knowledge for survival. These stories preserved culture, taught lessons, and entertained young and old alike. Music, song, and dance were part of daily and ceremonial life. Drums, lyres, flutes, and simple stringed instruments accompanied work, weddings, and festivals. Even in hardship, moments of joy and human connection punctuated life, offering brief reprieves from toil and fear. Protection and threats. Dark Age villages were vulnerable. Raids from rival tribes or opportunistic thieves were common. Villagers built ditches, wooden palisades, and sometimes small watchtowers to warn of approaching danger. Communities relied on each other for defense. Men would grab weapons, while women and children hid or supported in other ways. Disease, hunger, and harsh weather were ever-present threats. Winter could be brutal, with food stores running low and freezing temperatures threatening livestock and humans alike. Epidemics spread quickly in crowded, unsanitary conditions, striking fear into villages where medicine was primitive and knowledge limited. The role of social hierarchy. Even in small villages, hierarchy mattered. Landowners or chieftains held authority, allocating fields, settling disputes, and representing the village in wider political or military matters. Craftsmen, healers, and traders had roles that elevated their status, while peasants labored under the authority of the landowner, providing food and services in exchange for protection and tenancy. Relationships were reciprocal. Villagers shared labor and resources, but obligations were expected. A family might work another's field in harvest season, and in return, neighbors would help during illness or repairs. These bonds ensured survival in an unpredictable world. Daily rhythms in the village. Life in the village followed a steady, seasonal rhythm. Dawn marked work in fields, tending animals, or gathering water. Midday brought meals and rest, while afternoons involved craft, repair, or teaching children survival skills. Evening fires were central, cooking, mending clothes, and sharing stories. Night was long, dark, and cold, punctuated by the sounds of wind, animals, and occasionally distant threats. Despite hardships, these villages were resilient. Knowledge of the land, cooperation among neighbors, and adaptive skills allowed communities to survive and sometimes even thrive amid constant uncertainty. Spiritual life and everyday beliefs. Religion in Dark Age Britain was not just a set of abstract ideas, it shaped every aspect of life. Villagers believed in both the seen and unseen worlds, blending remnants of pagan traditions with emerging Christian influence. Gods, spirits, saints, and ancestors were invoked daily for protection, health, and good harvests. People feared curses, witches, and evil spirits. A simple illness could be blamed on malevolent forces rather than natural causes. Houses were sometimes marked with protective symbols, charms, or amulets, and rituals were performed to ward off bad luck or appease supernatural beings. Christianity and the Church. By the Dark Ages, Christianity was spreading across Britain. Monasteries and churches became centers not only for worship but for education, healthcare, and community gatherings. Priests and monks were respected, though sometimes feared. They held knowledge of scripture, healing herbs, and ritual power. Church calendars dictated daily life. Fasts, feast days, and holy observances structured the year. Villagers attended Mass when possible, brought offerings, and sought confession or blessings. Saints were venerated locally, with small shrines or chapels dedicated to them. Some saints were believed to have protective powers over villages, crops, or livestock. Blending of pagan and Christian practices. Despite Christianity, older pagan beliefs persisted. Seasonal festivals like Beltane or Samhain merged with Christian holidays. People continued to honor spirits of the land, water, and hearth alongside Christian prayers. Trees, stones, and springs might be sacred, sites of offerings or focal points of communal rituals. For example, a family might hang a charm on a doorway to keep evil out, light candles in the church for blessings, and leave small offerings at a local sacred spring, all in the same week. Life was a tapestry of belief, where magic, superstition, and faith coexisted in practical and spiritual ways. Fear, punishment, and social control. Religion was also a tool of social control. Priests preached obedience, morality, and fear of divine punishment. Tales of hell, demons, and eternal suffering were common, instilling a sense of vigilance and fear. Sin was a constant concern, with confession and penance offering a path to redemption.
Yet hypocrisy and human desire complicated matters. Nobles and clergy sometimes indulged in the very vices they condemned. Villagers were aware of these contradictions, which created a subtle tension between spiritual authority and everyday survival. Christianity and the Church. By the Dark Ages, Christianity was spreading across Britain. Monasteries and churches became centers not only for worship but for education, healthcare, and community gatherings. Priests and monks were respected, though sometimes feared. They held knowledge of scripture, healing herbs, and ritual power. Church calendars dictated daily life. Fasts, feast days, and holy observances structured the year. Villagers attended Mass when possible, brought offerings, and sought confession or blessings. Saints were venerated locally with small shrines or chapels dedicated to them. Some saints were believed to have protective powers over villages, crops, or livestock. Blending of pagan and Christian practices. Despite Christianity, older pagan beliefs persisted. Seasonal festivals like Beltane or Samhain merged with Christian holidays. People continued to honor spirits of the land, water, and hearth alongside Christian prayers. Trees, stones, and springs might be sacred, sites of offerings or focal points of communal rituals. For example, a family might hang a charm on a doorway to keep evil out, light candles in the church for blessings, and leave small offerings at a local sacred spring, all in the same week. Life was a tapestry of belief, where magic, superstition, and faith coexisted in practical and spiritual ways. Fear, punishment, and social control. Religion was also a tool of social control. Priests preached obedience, morality, and fear of divine punishment. Tales of hell, demons, and eternal suffering were common, instilling a sense of vigilance and fear. Sin was a constant concern, with confession and penance offering a path to redemption. Yet hypocrisy and human desire complicated matters. Nobles and clergy sometimes indulged in the very vices they condemned. Villagers were aware of these contradictions, which created a subtle tension between spiritual authority and everyday survival.
The struggle for sustenance. Life in Dark Age Britain was a daily negotiation with hunger. Fields were small, tools primitive, and the weather unpredictable. One poor harvest could mean starvation for entire villages. People relied heavily on what they could grow, raise, or forage, and every meal was hard-won. The typical diet was simple and repetitive. Bread, often coarse, made from barley, rye, or oats, was the staple. Wheat was reserved for the wealthier classes. Porridges, gruels, and pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat, filled the daily menu. Meat was scarce for peasants, reserved for special occasions or when hunting game could supply it. Fish was more common in rivers or along coasts, salted or smoked to last through the winter. Farming life and labor. The rhythm of life followed the land. Villagers rose at dawn to tend fields, plow with oxen, sow seed, and weed crops. Harvest season was grueling. Everyone worked together, from children to the elderly, to gather grains before frost or rain ruined them. Livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, and a few cows, were vital for milk, cheese, wool, and occasional meat. Tools were simple: wooden plows, sickles, and hoes. Fertilization came from animal dung, and irrigation relied on rivers or rainfall. The land was unforgiving. Crop failure could devastate a village. Famine was a real constant threat, and reliance on preserved food was essential.
Foraging, hunting, and gathering. When fields failed or extra nutrition was needed, villagers turned to the forests, rivers, and marshes. Berries, nuts, wild herbs, mushrooms, and roots supplemented meager rations. Hunting provided game, but strict forest laws, often enforced by local lords, limited what peasants could take. Poaching was dangerous, punishable by fines or even mutilation. Fishing, though more accessible, required skill and endurance. Women and children often gathered shellfish or freshwater fish, while men set traps or fished from small boats. Every bite mattered, and every resource was carefully rationed. Food preparation and preservation. Cooking was basic. Most people used a single pot over an open fire, boiling grains, vegetables, and occasional meat into a thick, hearty pottage. Bread was baked in communal ovens, a social yet necessary chore. Herbs and salt were prized for flavoring and preservation. Preservation techniques were vital: smoking meat and fish, drying grains, pickling vegetables, and storing root crops in cool cellars helped ensure survival through long winters. Any waste could be fatal. Nothing was thrown away lightly. Meals and social context. Meals were communal. Families ate together, sharing whatever little they had. Hierarchies were visible even at the table. Wealthier villagers or local lords ate richer fare with meat, fine bread, and ale, while peasants subsisted mostly on pottage and bread. Ale was common even for children, safer than often contaminated water. Feasts, when they occurred, were both social and political events. Harvest celebrations, religious festivals, or visits from nobility brought out the best food available, though such occasions were rare for the poor majority. Scarcity and survival strategies. Survival meant constant adaptation. Villagers stored seeds carefully, shared excess produce with neighbors, and bartered for what they lacked. Every season carried risk. Disease could decimate livestock, storms could ruin crops, and cold winters could kill children or the elderly. Starvation was a looming reality. Records show that farvests led to desperate measures, eating roots, bark, or even resorting to theft. In some historical accounts, famine led to migration, abandonment of villages, and social unrest. The interplay of wealth and diet. Food was a visible marker of social status. Nobles feasted on meats, spices, and imported goods, while the majority survived on the simplest fare. The contrast was stark. While the Lord's Hall was filled with roasted boar, honeyed pies, and wine, the peasant's table offered coarse bread, watery pottage, and occasional vegetables. Yet, despite scarcity, ingenuity persisted. Villagers cultivated hardy crops, learned preservation techniques, and maximized what the land offered. Survival was an art of careful planning, endurance, and respect for the rhythms of nature.
The village layout and social structure. Dark Age Britain was largely rural. Villages were small clusters of homes, often centered around a communal green, a stream, or a small hill. Fields surrounded the settlement, and paths, muddy in rain, dusty in summer, linked homes to farmland, woods, and neighboring villages. Each village had its hierarchy. At the top was the local lord or landowner, sometimes a minor noble, sometimes a freeholder. Beneath him were the freemen, small landowners with a modest house and a few acres to till. Most of the population were peasants or serfs, bound to the land and providing labor in exchange for shelter and protection. Communal spaces were vital. A village green might host fairs, gatherings, or judicial meetings. Streams or wells were shared for drinking, washing, and irrigation. Everything was done in close proximity, and privacy was minimal. Life was public, communal, and harsh. Homes, materials, structure, and size. The majority of people lived in simple homes made from timber, wattle and daub, or stone in regions where it was available. Roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, and floors were often bare earth, sometimes reinforced with rushes or straw mats. Interiors were minimalistic. A single room might serve as kitchen, living room, and sleeping quarters. The hearth was central, providing heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke often filled the room, escaping through a hole in the roof or a rudimentary chimney. Furniture was sparse: benches, stools, a few chests for storage, and basic tables. Beds were straw-filled mattresses, often shared by multiple family members. For wealthier households, homes might be larger, with separate sleeping quarters, a proper hearth, and even wooden floors. But for most, warmth and shelter were precious commodities, and everyone crowded close to the fire during winter nights. Daily domestic life. Domestic life revolved around survival and labor. Women carried the bulk of household duties, fetching water, preparing meals, tending to children, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and maintaining the home. Men worked the fields, repaired structures, hunted, and handled trade or payments to lords. Children contributed from an early age, learning skills through observation and participation. Hygiene was minimal. Most villages lacked proper sanitation, and waste was discarded outside homes, often attracting flies, rodents, and disease. Bathing was infrequent. Water was precious and usually reserved for cooking or limited washing. Public bathhouses existed in towns, but rural villagers rarely had access. Cooking was labor-intensive. Meals required firewood, water, and constant attention. Pots hung over open flames, and everyone worked together to grind grain, tend animals, or gather vegetables. The smell of smoke, cooking food, and sometimes decay was ever present. Seasonal life in villages. Life followed the seasons. Spring meant planting and tending crops. Summer brought harvest, and autumn required storing food and preparing for winter. Winter was the harshest season, with short days, freezing temperatures, and little work in the fields. Villagers huddled around hearths, repaired tools, and spun wool to pass the time. Celebrations punctuated this rhythm. Seasonal festivals, religious holidays, and harvest days offered moments of joy, storytelling, and music.
Yet even these were tempered by scarcity and labor. Feasts were modest for the poor and extravagant only for the wealthy. Community and survival. Villages were survival units. Cooperation was essential. Neighbors helped with construction, harvests, or defending against threats. Isolation was dangerous. Disease, famine, or raiding could devastate a community, and mutual support ensured that at least some survived. Religion permeated daily life. Small chapels or local shrines dotted villages, and spiritual practice guided farming, health, and morality. Monks, priests, and holy symbols were integrated into homes and fields, influencing every aspect of life. Contrasts and inequalities. Despite communal living, life varied dramatically by class. Lords enjoyed larger homes, better food, and security. Freemen had modest comfort and some autonomy. Peasants and serfs faced cramped, smoky homes, meager diets, and constant labor. Yet, even among the poorest, resourcefulness and community bonds allowed survival in a harsh world. The architecture, daily chores, and social interactions of village life illustrate a delicate balance between endurance, cooperation, and adaptation. Homes were simple, but they were the foundation of survival, family, and society in Dark Age Britain.
Everyday clothing, simplicity meets function. For the majority of people in Dark Age Britain, clothing was simple and functional. Wool was the most common material, hand-spun and woven into coarse fabrics for warmth. Linen, made from flax, was lighter and used for undergarments or summer wear. Animal hides and furs provided additional warmth, especially during harsh winters. Men typically wore tunics that reached the knees, belted at the waist, with simple trousers or leggings. Cloaks fastened with brooches protected them from rain and wind. Women wore long dresses or tunics, often layered for warmth, sometimes cinched with a belt. Sleeves varied in width and lengths could indicate age, status, or occupation. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult clothing, often patched and handed down from older siblings. Function always outweighed fashion. Durability was essential in a world of constant labor and harsh conditions. Colors, decoration, and social signals. Despite the simple fabrics, color and decoration carried meaning. Dyes were expensive, so bright colors were typically reserved for the wealthy. Commoners wore muted browns, grays, and natural wool tones. Wealthy lords, freemen with means, and local nobility might sport deep reds, blues, and greens. Patterns and embroidery were more than decoration. They signaled identity. Geometric stitching, symbolic motifs, and carefully woven trims could denote a person's community, profession, or family ties. Jewelry, belts, and brooches further communicated social rank, wealth, or achievements. Footwear and accessories. Most people wore leather shoes or simple sandals, often crudely made and patched repeatedly. Boots were rare, mostly for those traveling long distances or engaged in outdoor work. Hats and hoods protected heads from cold and rain, while cloaks with simple clasps allowed freedom of movement while keeping the body warm.
Belts were multifunctional, holding knives, pouches, or tools. They were practical yet could be decorative for those who could afford embellishments. Women often carried small pouches for personal items, while men might attach a pouch or dagger to their belt. Specialized clothing for occupation and ritual. Certain garments marked occupation. Shepherds, fishermen, and laborers wore sturdier, simpler clothing suited for work. Tradesmen might add small adornments to indicate guild membership or craft. Ceremonial clothing was distinct. Priests, monks, and nuns wore robes reflecting spiritual hierarchy, while warriors donned tunics with metal fittings and cloaks dyed in their lord's colors. Festivals and religious rituals often allowed temporary display of brighter or more decorative clothing, even for the common folk. Material culture, tools, household items, and everyday life. Clothing was only part of material culture. People lived with simple tools, wooden bowls, ceramic pots, iron knives, and woven baskets. Metal was valuable. Swords, axes, and cooking utensils were carefully maintained. Storage containers, chests, and textiles were crucial for preserving food, clothing, and valuables. Even in poverty, craftsmanship was vital. Clothing and identity. In Dark Age Britain, clothing communicated more than warmth. It expressed survival, social rank, occupation, and cultural identity. A woolen tunic could mark a peasant, while embroidery and dyed fabric could identify a freeman or local lord. Accessories like belts, brooches, and pouches added layers of meaning. For the poorest, clothing was recycled, patched, and handed down. Survival demanded practicality over style. For the wealthy, it was a display of wealth, status, and taste. In every garment, from the humblest tunic to the grandest cloak, history was woven. Threads of culture, labor, and identity.
A day at the table, meals for the majority. For most people in Dark Age Britain, food was simple, hearty, and dictated by the seasons. The peasantry lived close to the land, and their diet reflected what they could grow, raise, or gather. Breakfast might be a piece of coarse bread soaked in ale or milk, sometimes accompanied by dried fruits or nuts. The main meal of the day, eaten at noon or early afternoon, was often pottage, a thick, stew-like concoction made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Barley, oats, and rye formed the base, while leeks, onions, beans, cabbage, and herbs added flavor and nutrition. For many, this dish provided the bulk of daily sustenance, filling but simple. Meat was a luxury. Only the wealthier could afford beef, mutton, or pork regularly. Peasants relied on preserved foods, salted pork, smoked fish, or game caught in nearby woods. Eggs, milk, and cheese supplemented protein intake, while foraged foods like berries, nuts, and mushrooms added variety. Hunting, fishing, and foraging. Hunting and fishing were essential for survival, especially in rural areas. Men with access to rivers or forests would fish for eels, salmon, and freshwater species, while trapping small game like rabbits or squirrels supplemented diets. Foraging for wild plants, herbs, and roots added essential nutrients, especially in lean years. Seasonal cycles dictated what could be eaten fresh, dried, or preserved. Spring and summer brought greens, berries, and herbs. Autumn was harvest time. Grains, apples, pears, and root vegetables were collected, dried, and stored for winter. Winter diets were often meager, relying on stored grains, salted meat, and preserved vegetables.
Cooking methods: fire, pot, and hearth. Most households had a central hearth for cooking. Open fires, often in the center of the dwelling, allowed boiling, roasting, and baking. Cast iron pots, ceramic vessels, and spit roasting over flames were common techniques. Smoke-filled homes were a constant reality, and soot-stained walls and ceilings were the norm. Boiling was the most common method, as water could be used to cook grains, vegetables, and meat together, creating nourishing stews. Baking bread required communal ovens in villages. Those without access had to travel or share facilities. Roasting meat on spits was reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. Spices, flavors, and preservation. Salt was vital, not only for flavor, but for preserving meat and fish. Herbs like parsley, thyme, sage, and garlic were widely used when available. Exotic spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were expensive imports, mostly enjoyed by nobility or the wealthy elite. Food preservation was critical. Smoking, salting, drying, and pickling were the main methods to ensure survival through the long winters. Potatoes hadn't arrived yet, so root vegetables, grains, and legumes became staples. Honey and ale provided sweeteners and calories when sugar was rare or non-existent. Meals and social life. Meals were more than sustenance. They were moments of community and hierarchy. Peasant families ate together, often with hands and shared utensils in dimly lit homes. Wealthy households enjoyed large feasts with multiple courses serving roasted meats, breads, cheeses, pies, and imported delicacies.
Sharing meals reinforced social structures. Lords and kings displayed power through lavish banquets, while the peasantry maintained survival-focused communal eating habits. In monasteries, meals were regulated, often austere, reflecting both religious devotion and communal discipline. Fasting, feasts, and religion. Religious practice heavily influenced diet. Fasting periods like Lent required abstinence from meat, eggs, and dairy for extended periods. Fish became a vital substitute. Feasts, by contrast, offered opportunities for indulgence, with elaborate dishes reflecting wealth and status. Even the peasantry observed religious dietary rules, sometimes modifying their simple meals to align with church expectations. This intertwining of faith and food shaped not only what people ate, but how they thought about nourishment, morality, and community. Food, survival, and hardship. For the majority, survival often trumped taste. Poor harvests, cold winters, and disease outbreaks could turn simple meals into struggles. Hunger was a constant threat, and famine periods were common. Women and children worked tirelessly to prepare whatever food was available, grinding grain, boiling pottage, and preserving what could be stored for the lean months. Yet, within hardship, there was resilience. Even the humblest meal carried the efforts of the family, the rhythms of the seasons, and centuries of knowledge about how to endure. Each bite was a small victory against the harsh realities of Dark Age Britain.
Humble homes and hearths. Most people in Dark Age Britain lived in simple dwellings, constructed from what the land offered. Peasant houses were typically small, one-room structures made of wattle and daub, woven wooden strips plastered with mud, or timber frames filled with clay. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, providing basic insulation against rain, snow, and wind. Smoke from central hearths escaped through thatched roofs or small holes, leaving interiors smoky and dim. Inside, the space was multifunctional. Families slept, ate, worked, and stored their possessions all in one room. Straw or rushes covered the floor, sometimes layered over dirt to keep it cleaner. Wooden benches and rough tables provided seating, while simple chests held clothing, tools, and any valuables. Privacy was scarce, and every action, from cooking to mending clothes, was performed in close quarters. Wealthier households or minor nobles enjoyed stone-built halls, larger spaces divided into private chambers and multiple hearths. These homes reflected social status and allowed for some separation of work, leisure, and sleep. Tapestries or cloth might decorate walls, both for insulation and display, while larger windows were rare, covered with oiled cloth or shutters. Village organization. Most people lived in small villages clustered around arable land. Villages were a combination of scattered farmsteads and denser clusters of homes near a communal space or road. The local lord or monastery often oversaw land use, dictating crop rotations, labor obligations, and who could graze animals where. Common pastures, meadows, and forests were shared resources. Peasants grew cereals like barley, oats, and rye, alongside vegetables, flax for linen, and fruit trees when possible. Livestock, pigs, cows, sheep, and chickens, supplemented diets and provided materials for clothing and tools. Paths between homes were unpaved and muddy, and sanitation was minimal. Waste was often dumped in pits or nearby rivers, leading to foul smells and frequent disease. Despite hardships, villages had a sense of rhythm, marked by seasonal tasks, religious festivals, and market days when traveling merchants brought news and goods.
Daily work and labor. Life in Dark Age Britain was defined by labor. From dawn to dusk, peasants worked the land to feed their families and fulfill obligations to lords. Men plowed, sowed, harvested, and maintained fences, while women tended gardens, cared for children, spun thread, wove cloth, and prepared food. Children were included in work from an early age, learning skills essential for survival. The rhythm of labor followed the seasons. Spring demanded sowing and weeding. Summer required tending crops and harvesting. Autumn was for storing grain, curing meat, and preparing for winter. Winter brought repair work, firewood gathering, and limited outdoor activity. Work was arduous, physical, and unrelenting, yet necessary for survival. Artisans and tradespeople added complexity to village life. Blacksmiths forged tools, nails, and household items. Carpenters built and repaired homes. Potters and weavers created functional goods for daily life and trade. Even in small villages, these specialists were critical for maintaining the economy and infrastructure. Markets and trade. Villages rarely operated in isolation. Markets, fairs, and traveling merchants connected even remote communities to broader trade networks. Local markets offered foodstuffs, tools, clothing, and occasional luxuries like spices or imported textiles. Fairs drew larger crowds and allowed the exchange of livestock, crafts, and information. Trade introduced new ideas, technologies, and styles. Coins facilitated economic exchange, but barter remained common. Even the smallest village might host a blacksmith's services, a baker selling bread, or a healer offering herbs and remedies. These small hubs of commerce shaped daily life, providing goods and news that broke the monotony of rural existence. Religion and community life. Faith permeated daily routines. Churches or simple chapels often occupied central positions in villages, providing spiritual guidance, communal gathering spaces, and even shelter during crises. Clergy taught basic literacy, administered baptisms, marriages, and burials, and offered counsel to villagers. Religious festivals structured the year, blending celebration with ritual observance. Communal activities, repairing dikes, clearing forests, or organizing seasonal hunts, created bonds between villagers. Despite harsh living conditions, these communities maintained a sense of identity, mutual support, and resilience, grounded in shared labor, beliefs, and survival. Survival, hardship, and resilience. Life was harsh. Disease, famine, and occasional raiding by rival groups threatened survival. Homes were cold, drafty, and prone to fire. Food could fail. Winters were brutal, yet resilience defined daily life. Skills passed from generation to generation. Farming techniques, craft knowledge, and communal problem-solving ensured continuity despite hardship. Even in adversity, small joys existed. Shared meals, storytelling by the fire, seasonal celebrations, and acts of generosity fostered community bonds. These moments brought relief, laughter, and continuity in a world dominated by labor and scarcity. Clothing, fashion, and personal appearance in Dark Age Britain. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into a village in Dark Age Britain. The chill of the morning air bites at your skin, and the scent of smoke from peat fires fills the narrow lanes. The clothes around you speak volumes, not through labels or brands, but through color, texture, and craft. In this world, clothing was far more than decoration. It was survival, identity, and status, wrapped in wool, linen, and leather. For the majority, the peasants, clothing was simple, functional, and durable. Wool tunics, often homespun and patched over years of wear, provided warmth in winter and comfort in cooler months. Linen undergarments, softer against the skin, were prized but rare, as weaving fine cloth required time, skill, and resources that only a few could spare. Belts held knives, pouches, or keys. Hoods protected faces from the wind, and cloaks, fastened with simple brooches, shielded bodies from rain and frost. Peasant men wore knee-length tunics, sometimes dyed with earthy tones from local plants, while women wrapped themselves in longer garments with aprons for work and practicality. Yet, even among the simple, clothing conveyed subtle markers of identity. A dyed strip of cloth, a decorated clasp, or a colored cord might indicate a village, a family, or an occupation. A man working as a blacksmith might have soot-stained sleeves and leather patches. A woman tending animals or fields wore practical boots or simple leather shoes mended countless times. Even the poor displayed ingenuity, adding trims, beads, or embroidery salvaged from older garments, giving hints of individuality in a world of scarcity.
Among the wealthier classes, fashion became a language of power. Nobles and successful merchants wore garments of imported wool, silk, and even fur, dyed in deep blues, reds, and greens that spoke of wealth and influence. Brooches, rings, and belts became symbols of status, each carefully crafted and often inherited across generations. Cloaks lined with fur were not mere warmth, they were a visible proclamation of rank. Women in wealthier households adorned themselves with elaborate pins, beaded necklaces, and richly dyed gowns, their hair carefully braided, sometimes wrapped in linen veils, silk scarves, or even gold threads. Men, too, used clothing and grooming to signal social position, sporting carefully trimmed hair, beards, and cloaks that swept the ground during ceremonial occasions. Hair and grooming were as important as clothing. Wives and daughters of peasants braided hair tightly to keep it clean and manageable, while wealthier women styled elaborate plaits or coils, sometimes covered with veils or decorative bands. Men trimmed their hair according to local custom. A neatly cropped beard could convey respectability, while long hair might signal warrior status. Bathing was sporadic for most, limited by water availability, but ritual cleanliness mattered. Soap, made from tallow and ashes, was a luxury, yet herbs like lavender, rosemary, or thyme were often used to scent the body and deter lice.
Accessories were both practical and symbolic. Leather pouches, sheaths, and bags hung from belts, carrying tools, coins, or small charms. Brooches fastened cloaks, but their design might signal allegiance to a lord or region. Finger rings, sometimes engraved with symbols, were signs of wealth and occasionally functioned as seals for letters. Even the smallest details communicated identity, reputation, and social ties in a world where words alone could not convey rank. Color and material were especially